Hello and welcome to Skepticast, the podcast that makes you cocktail party smart in 15 minutes-ish. Today, we're asking a simple question. Where do white people come from? White people have been in the news recently since around 1492, and, a lot of the coverage of white people in the US, it's been very negative. It seems like every time you open the news or you look on social media, people are criticizing white people, and as a white person myself, I just want to say, what did we ever do to anybody else? Oh, Mimi, it looks like Mimi is screaming at me on Zoom, but Mimi, you're stuck on mute. I'm kidding, of course. White people, we don't have the best history. We have a history of taking things that don't belong to us, like culture or Brooklyn. We do some things well. I say that primarily because as a skinny white boy, I'm legally obligated to defend Vampire Weekend. But our question today is more specific. Where do white people come from? You're probably thinking Europe, but that doesn't really answer our question. We know where Europeans come from, which is a tiny cave with funny accents, hand-rolled cigarettes, and a bunch of angry popes. But Europeans are French, English, Danish, and European. They have white skin, but historically, they didn't necessarily identify as white. They might refer to themselves as part of Occidental culture, contrasting themselves with Oriental culture, which was used to refer to Asia, a continent of a casual 3 billion or more people. But it was after mass waves of immigration to America, assimilation, and intermarriage that Europeans started to go from German and English and Welsh and so on to white. In her book, White Identity Politics, the Duke political scientist Ashley Jardina points out that many white Americans today are actually descended from immigrants who, when they first arrived in America, would not have been considered white. So whiteness can expand and contract to include or exclude different identities, and has done so at different periods in American history. So most research indicates that whiteness as this kind of fixed identity category is really an American invention. And like most great American inventions, it was created by immigrants. So how did this happen? And what are some examples of this kind of identity formation taking place? Who better to help us answer that question than our guest today, who is both a white guy and an immigrant who studies political economy and racial integration in the United States. Our guest today is Marco Tabellini. He's a professor in the Business, Government, and International Economy Unit at Harvard Business School. He recently completed his PhD in economics at MIT and has published extensively on this subject. Marco, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Mimi and Cooper. It's my pleasure to be with you today.
We should also say Marco was our old professor, and so it's very nice to interact with him when he does not control our grades. So, Marco, a lot of your research seems to center on something called the Great Migration. So the U.S. educational system is what it is. So I'm going to ask you to explain to me and the listeners, what was the Great Migration?
Yeah, so the Great Migration is referred to by historians when talking about the massive movement of African Americans outside, who moved away from the U.S. South and into the U.S. West and North. Between 1910 and 1970, around 6 million African Americans moved away from the South. This happened in two waves between 1915 and 1930, during the first Great Migration, when roughly 1.5 million Black people moved out. And then during the 30s, this movement kind of paused because of the Great Depression. But then after 1940, it started again, and another 4.5 African Americans left the US South. And clearly, this was an episode that changed dramatically the racial boundaries and the racial demographic composition of the United States. Just to give you an idea, around 1910, only 10% of the African American population was living outside of the South. By the end of the Great Migration, more than half of the African American population was living outside of the region.
Wow. So that's a very significant movement of people. And in your research, you talk about the role that the Great Migration and the massive influx of African Americans to the North and West played in sort of reducing social distance, to abuse that phrase, between European immigrants who previously did not identify with each other. So put more simply, a lot of people who weren't white before suddenly became white. Can you kind of explain how that happened?
As probably you know, many Europeans moved to the United States. What you don't know is how many of them, like more than 30 million Europeans during the age of mass migration had migrated from Europe to the United States between 1850 and 1920. And upon arrival, they did not, as Cooper just said, find a welcoming environment. In fact, especially the Southern and Eastern Europeans and the Irish immigrants who were Catholic, or in the case of Eastern Europeans, often Jewish, they were heavily opposed by the native whites living in the United States at the time, and the nativist movements were widespread. So recent research with Vicky Fuca from Stanford Political Science and Sean Mazudmer, who was a PhD student at the government department at Harvard, we studied an idea that had been proposed in history, which is namely the idea that as African Americans move northward, the European immigrants who used to be perceived as distant culturally from native whites became part of the majority group. And the idea, in our paper we argue, was that when African Americans arrived to the US North and West, this represented the arrival of a new outgroup in the society, and this outgroup was more different along a new and salient dimension in the eyes of the native whites relative to, say, an Italian immigrant. So let me give you, given my Italian background, a simple example of how I think of the process. Basically, until 1910, an Italian immigrant moving, say, to New York City was perceived as an Italian Catholic immigrant. After 1920, the same Italian person, after the arrival of hundreds of thousands of African Americans, was likely perceived much more as simply a white individual, and his or her religious faith and the language that he or she spoke kind of became second order, at least at first sight.
In your research, did you guys observe a similar dynamic? For example, when there was a massive wave of Irish immigrants, did that also kind of reduce distance, to use that phrase, among the kind of, quote, native whites, which is a term that probably isn't, we shouldn't be using, but, the whites who'd been there longer, I guess. So, for example, if there were British and French, did the arrival of Irish kind of bring them closer together?
So we didn't explore this systematically. Anecdotally, what you read in historical newspapers, and we've used a lot of these historical newspapers in our research, is that the arrival of a new group in the society tends to unite the existing outgroups into the majority, favoring their assimilation, at least as long as the new group that arrives is more distant than the previous ones relative to the natives, at least along some specific dimension. Now, of course, this might seem a little bit abstract, but to give you a concrete example, what we did examine within the Great Migration was the same effect of the arrival of African Americans on groups that were perceived perhaps more distant along for example, color of skin or other physical attributes relative to the Italian or the Irish immigrants, namely Mexican or Chinese immigrants. So while European immigration was not restricted until the mid-1920s, Chinese immigration had been restricted since 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act. And Chinese immigration, especially in the west of the United States, was a very salient issue, and we conjecture and we test whether the arrival of African Americans changed the perception and thus the assimilation of Chinese immigrants that were living in the same areas, essentially, of the European immigrants. And we do not find any effect. And this is consistent with a framework where the arrival of this very new migrants or groups does not influence the perception of other groups that were already there, but that were sufficiently, quote unquote, far from the majority group, that the arrival of this new social group does not really change the perception of the natives, so to speak.
Interesting. And so for anybody who's listening who's not 100% sure, because again, the US education system is what it is, the Chinese Exclusion Act was a law in the 1880s that actually banned all immigration from China into the US. And it was on the books for, you probably know, it was on the books for a really long time.
Yeah, what happened was basically that in 1882, following heated debate and upheaval, especially in the west of the United States, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. And then starting in the late 1890s, the anti-immigrant sentiment spread to other groups, especially the new, what they were called the new Europeans, so Europeans from Southern and Eastern Europe. And the massive debate took off, eventually culminated in the Immigration Acts of the 1920s. But again, the exclusion of Chinese and then Japanese immigrants as well from 1907 with the Japanese Gentlemen's Agreement. Not sure what that Gentlemen's Agreement stands for, but anyway.
Interesting use of the term gentleman.
Exactly. And that remained in place until essentially 1965, when the immigration system in the United States was changed dramatically.
That's fascinating. So then, in a way, it sounds like, according to some of your research, and I know this is a bit off of kind of our primary topic, but it sounds like the Chinese Exclusion Act, in a lot of ways, was almost the blueprint for some of the later anti-immigration legislation that we saw in the early 20th century.
Yes, and actually, even before that, there were attempts to restrict immigration even before the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. In the 1850s, the Know Nothing Party emerged strongly in the Northeast and in particular Massachusetts and Boston against Irish immigrants that were coming. And those same Irish immigrants then were according to historical sources, among the strongest opponents of African Americans and those that displayed the highest degree of racism. And one reason pointed out by historical literature is that Irish immigrants, but not just Irish, Italians as well, had to signal their whiteness to the native whites. And so the best way for doing that was precisely to show off, in some sense, the racism against this new outgroup, to signal to the majority group that, hey, guys, look, we are also part of your own group. We are against this other group. And so there is abundant evidence of the clash between Irish immigrants in the 20s and in the African-American migrants in several northern cities.
Wow. So I also, just to go back to something earlier in that comment, I love that I always forget there was actually a party called the Know Nothing Party. And it's just, I wonder if we'll ever have a political party that's that honest again. I mean, they really just kind of laid it out on the table. So then it makes sense when you talk about, because the Irish immigrants were sort of at the bottom of the food chain, so to speak, and they were therefore in competition with African Americans, who at that point many were relatively recently freed slaves, if we're talking about kind of the late 19th century. And so how can you kind of determine how much of the racism they showed in the United States was a tool of assimilation versus how much of that was sort of pre-existing? You know, like in Ireland, were there very significant racist attitudes at the time? Or was it really in the US just kind of a tool of convenience to increase their sort of position in the pecking order?
So the answer to your question is that we view these actions as mostly instrumental in getting kind of a step ahead in the social status ladder. And this behavior was not specific to Irish immigrants. It was shared by Italian immigrants, Polish, and other immigrant groups who, precisely as the Irish, were competing for status in Northern American cities. And so they had to do their best to kind of signal their different and better, quote unquote, status. Now, we do not observe directly this behavior of Irish and Italian or other immigrant groups in our work. What we do is instead we try to check whether the behavior of the natives and the behavior of the immigrants changed in a way that is consistent with the idea that European immigrants became more integrated and that native whites accepted them more quickly into their groups. And here is where I told before, Cooper, let me take a step back, because I think one interesting concept, at least to us, is that when thinking about the assimilation of a minority group, there are two dimensions that I think in the political debate are often conflated with each other. And one is the effort that immigrants or minorities more broadly exert to fit in, to become part of the majority group. And the other side is, of course, willingness among the members of the majority group to accept them. And so the setting that we examine in our research with Vicky and Sean allows us to make some progress and trying to disentangle the effort and the acceptance. And we argue that the closer the outgroup, in this case, for example, the Italian immigrants, was to the new outgroup, so to the African Americans, the more effort that group would try and signal or to make it into the majority group. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, the farther you are from the new outgroup and closer to the majority group to begin with, the lower the effort that you need to exert in order to become part of the majority club, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And we can exploit the fact that older European immigrants, so those from Northern and Western Europe, with the exception of Ireland because of their Catholic religious affiliation, they were perceived as being culturally much closer. So in fact, Madison Grant, who was considered the father of eugenics and racism in the United States, well, he was in the United States, so
it's a fun legacy.
A fun legacy, yeah. And he wrote a book which is called The Passing of the Great Race, which is really kind of one of the main books on scientific racism. And according to the alleged science behind the book, there was no concept of unique white group. There were different layers and different races within the Europeans, with the Western and Northern Europeans at the very top, and the Southern Europeans and the Alpines, so the Mediterraneans and the Alpines at the very bottom. And so we can measure the behavior of natives and of immigrants, depending on the country of origin of the immigrants, trying to test whether indeed, as the new group, in this case African American, moved to the north and west of the United States, whether effort and successful assimilation kind of varied depending on the initial distance between immigrant groups and the native whites.
So basically there were sort of a lot of people at the time, they were recent immigrants, and they kind of became racist by convenience rather than conviction. It was sort of almost a tool of social advancement. Also, listening to the amount of and thinking about the amount of time and energy and research that so many of the white leaders at the time put into just this pseudo race science. It's like if they had just applied themselves elsewhere, we could have flying cars by now. But I wanted to ask another question, because you're talking about how you sort of measured this, what you're studying. But I'm curious, because I'm going to venture a guess and say you didn't go back to the 18 and 1900s and ask people who looked white how they feel about other people who look white now that a bunch of African Americans were there. So what are the variables, and how are you really measuring the assimilation and the integration and the in-groups and the out-groups?
Yeah, so I think this is one of the most exciting part of my work. As you said at the beginning, I'm a political economist, but I have a strong interest in economic history. And as an economic historian, I'm lucky enough that I can rely on the full count census of population of the United States that are fully digitized, and actually they are publicly available. So this literally allows us to measure, to observe in each census decade between 1910 and 1930, the characteristics of all individuals living in the United States. And so this makes it possible for us, for example, to know whether an Italian immigrant applied for citizenship. He, because at the time only men could apply for citizenship, so he got accepted. And in fact, back then, 99%, according to the estimates, almost all the applications for citizenship were kind of approved. So with the richness of the US Census data, we measure assimilation effort by looking at naturalization rates among European immigrants and we also look at the names that they chose for their kids. So the census manuscripts allow us to know how, for example, an Italian immigrant named his or her kid. And there's research, and we build on that has constructed an American-sounding name, essentially tells you how likely it is that if you read Marco, you think, oh, this is a name given by an American of American parentage versus an immigrant. And so we can construct a score to measure how American-sounding the names of the immigrant kids were. These are the two main proxies that we use for effort, and instead to look at successful assimilation, we consider what social scientists broadly consider the very last step and the ultimate step of assimilation, which is intermarriage. So it's the marriage between an immigrant and a native of native parentage. And what we find is that, consistent with what we've been informally discussing so far, that in cities in the north that received more African Americans during the period between 1915 and 1930, on the one hand, naturalization rates became higher among immigrants, and the sounding name of this index that I mentioned became, again, also more American. On the other hand, intermarriage rates between natives and immigrants increased. And when we kind of unpack this, we find that the effort was disproportionately exerted by those immigrants that had to compete for status with African Americans, so the Southern and Eastern Europeans, as well as those immigrants that were living in cities where the industrial sector and the manufacturing sector, where many African Americans got attracted to, was higher. On the other hand, the immigrants from Northern and Western Europe were more likely to intermarry with natives, even though they did not significantly increase their efforts to fit in.
Mm-hmm. So that's all fascinating, and it's kind of making me want to ask the question, do you think it's accurate to say that white people, as an identity category, obviously not, as of people of European heritage, do you think it's accurate to say that white people were invented in America?
So one may be tempted to say yes, and I think this is an example in which probably you would say yes. It's possible, though, that what we now are referring to whiteness in other contexts has different names, but refers to this idea of majority group. Now, I guess in the American context, we know that the concept of whiteness has become synonymous of majority group. From these lenses, I think the answer to your question is yes. And we have some evidence consistent with this. We don't have survey, of course, to go back in 1920, but we have access to the historical press. And so you can also try to test whether in cities that received more African Americans, you, on the one hand, observe a higher frequency of joint terms in the same article that refer to African Americans and disparaging attributes, and to see whether there is an increase in racism targeted towards the Black race. And at the same time, we can check what happens to those immigrant groups that were previously considered outgroups. So, for example, now I can make fun of this because I'm Italian, so we know that Italians were considered at the time as kind of bringing mafia, as, being violent, consuming alcohol, all these sort of things. And so we search for these ethnic stereotypes, and we see exactly the opposite pattern. So in cities that received more African Americans, the ethnic stereotype of these Italian mafiosi or Italian violence and so on, they faded away. And so the interpretation that we give is that Italians and other immigrant groups got gradually incorporated in this broader idea of whiteness, which literally was not existing when, for example, Madison Grant was writing his book on scientific racism, The Passing of the Great Race. There, the Great Race was the race of the Nordic race. It had nothing to do with white and black or white and other races conceived as we conceive them today. I guess the main takeaway is really that social boundaries are fluid, and migration can change them as new groups arrive. And then this boundaries are redefined according to the traits that are become more salient at a given point in time, and then there might be path dependence. And so this is what, for example, we've seen after 1920 or 1930.
Mm-hmm. And so you also mentioned earlier on a little bit about how you were looking at citizenship and naturalization rates, and you mentioned that only men could apply. Did you look at how assimilation was maybe the same or different across gender? So were men more likely to kind of try to be racist because they were able to get more access to the workforce, or were women, because they were lower status, were they going to try to be more racist because they could potentially elevate them? Or, did you see any differences by gender?
So that's a very interesting question. One fact that I learned when working on this topic was that, for example, if a native white woman was marrying an immigrant, she would lose her citizenship until the husband was able to get it. So for sure, until the suffrage laws that were passed around that same time, basically women were not politically engaged, with some caveats. For example, in the late 1910s and 1920s, the prohibition movement, which actually targeted the immigrants who were blamed for drinking alcohol and kind of bringing to a situation of decay the American cities, they were opposing against saloons and alcohols. But I think really a turning point in the role of women was kind of later on with World War II. They were also relatively, actually much less likely than men to be in the workforce until the 1940s broadly. And this is also something that is hard to measure, of course, but most of our outcomes are focused on men.
Mm-hmm. This conversation has been absolutely fascinating, but also a little bleak, because we're talking about assimilation and immigration as kind of a zero-sum game where there's kind of a cabal of, quote, native whites at the top, and then a lot of people kind of competing to get on that same level. But have there been moments where we might be able to draw a little bit more hope for enhanced assimilation? For example, in the civil rights movement, there was kind of an effort to bridge class divides where white labor movements and Black civil rights activists could kind of form alliances. In your research, have you found anything that could actually make us a little bit more hopeful?
Yes. So again, with Vicky Fuca, who's a co-author with many other projects, we also study the Second Great Migration, which coincided with the rise and eventual success of the civil rights movement. And this is highly controversial, I think, in the literature. So there is a lot of evidence that the arrival of African Americans in northern cities increased residential segregation and reduced economic mobility of African Americans. However, when Vicky and I, together with Alvaro Calderon, who's a student at Stanford, who is co-author on this other project, we see that cities that received more African Americans became more likely to support the civil rights movement. And we argue that one of the mechanisms that was responsible for this was exactly as you said, Cooper, the fact that there was this cross-race alliance within the labor movement. Again, not all unions were in favor of racial equality, and in fact, very strong discrimination existed within even the unions. At the same time, the CIO, one of the main unions at the time, was pushing, at least at the national level, for racial equality. And so I think this is consistent more broadly with the idea which is called contact hypothesis, which was posited by Alport in 1954. The idea is that when two groups interact under certain circumstances, they can cooperate. Under others, they do not. And the circumstances in which they can cooperate are those in which they might have common goals. And so in the context of the Second Great Migration, if African Americans made the labor movement stronger, the racial distinction might have become less important, and the class identity instead might have become more salient, reducing the perceived distance when measured or when perceived along racial lines. So I think although the results from our first Great Migration paper kind of lead us to believe that migration and social hierarchies must be necessarily a zero-sum game, I think these other findings for the second Great Migration are instead a little bit more positive. And again, there are many caveats. So not all whites, of course, and sadly, were welcoming African Americans, but within the white electorate and within the white residents, some of them turned in favor of racial equality.
So it's sort of like a lot of white people in the North were saying, I don't really want you to live in my neighborhood, but I'll still march with you and vote in favor for laws that support you in different areas almost.
This is exactly one of the things that we find. So perhaps paradoxically, we find that white support for the civil rights was stronger in American cities where residential segregation was stronger. This at first sight, when we were kind of observing these results, we thought didn't make sense. But then if you think about it, that's exactly right. I mean, right in the sense of what you, Cooper, said, that is, as long as I can isolate myself from the new migrants, and as long as the civil rights is about the South, for example, on purpose, I even say, okay, we should support civil rights, but then I don't really care too much because I live isolated. In fact, we even find that these cities were able to create more independent school districts, and we interpret this as white communities being able to create their own school districts, segregating de facto African Americans in their neighborhoods with admittedly low quality schools and poor funding.
Yeah. So basically, everybody's woke until they have to actually do something, and then all of a sudden their calculus changes.
To give a little bit of a more positive view, this is definitely an interpretation. Another interpretation which we cannot rule out is that there are some whites and in general some members of the majority group that are more liberal, and then there are some others that are less open to diversity. And when diversity increases, it is the second group that starts to complain. And so perhaps the high residential segregation allows the individuals that are unwilling to live in diverse places, those that would complain, to kind of isolate themselves. Those that are more open to diversity, at that point, their voice is easier to be heard. So this is an alternative interpretation. Now, probably the truth lies kind of somewhere in the middle. It's unclear exactly where. So I guess it depends on how cynic we want to be. And
well, I've never been accused of being cynical, obviously. But so thank you again so much for being here. And I have kind of one final question to bring us through to today. Your research is really fascinating and I think very, very relevant to understand the roots of a lot of the issues the U.S. is talking about today. And so what kind of lessons from your research, whether it's a historical example of a policy intervention or other sort of phenomena you've observed in your research, what lessons could we draw for how we could actually improve race relations today? You know, with everything going on around Black Lives Matter, is there anything you think that we could learn to improve the situation today?
This is, of course, a very hard question to answer. I think there are lessons to learn, and one is precisely we should try to give and send a message in which, and this is of course easier to say and much harder to put in practice, but try to send a message that emphasizes identities that kind of cross the racial boundaries. As for the civil rights movement, the idea of a working class, as today perhaps the idea of, I think in some sense, the idea that back then Barack Obama was stressing of like, we are Americans. I mean, I'm an immigrant, whatever, but like America is a concept that belongs to everybody. And so to the extent to which we can frame these issues along a dimension that reduces the potential for competition in status or other resources, that might make it easier for the American society to reduce the inequalities that we know are pervasive. So I guess this is one lesson. And the other, which this is kind of unrelated perhaps, or loosely related to my research, but that I've been paying attention to during the last months with the Black Lives Matter movement, is that information is important. So we should try to spread information about how unequal opportunities are and how ingrained and persistent these have been. And this is where it's perhaps partly connected with my research. This is something that Nobel Prize Gunnar Myrdal said back in 1944, when the second Great Migration was really starting again. And Myrdal said, well, maybe the white northerner is not aware of the brutality of what's going on in the South. And so to the extent to which African-American migrants can provide that information, that might lead to stronger support for racial equality. And so I think it's important to keep talking about these issues because many Americans perhaps are not fully aware, I imagine, about the situation.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to close by saying thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. And we really appreciate you calling in from Italy, from the beautiful Milan, a little bit nicer and probably a little bit more functional as a country these days than a lot of where the US is. But we really appreciate it. And thank you everybody so much for listening. So again, this was our interview with Professor Marco Tabellini of Harvard Business School. And if you're interested in reading more about his papers, you can check out his faculty profile on the Harvard Business School website. Thank you so much, Marco.
Thank you very much, Mimi and Cooper, for giving me this fantastic opportunity.